I'd like to start off and invite you into my world. We're currently in the province of Guizhou in China. Decided to come here to start this collection with our team because there's so much to be shared, and I know that as much as we are inspired, I want others to be inspired from this work.
我们很想让你们创造你们自己的设置，在这个纽约的设置的衣服，
村子跟城市一起。
你自己想怎么画就怎么画。好。
What I think is interesting about fashion, though, is the way that it influences culture. And culture dictates everything. These are things that drive values. They're a reflection of what we care about and how we want to be perceived. Can we use coolness as a currency to make indigenous ways of being, making, and creating relevant? And that's exactly why we created Ribbon by Roots Studio. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca. I'm going to talk about how we got on this journey of bridging cultures. And oftentimes people ask me two questions. The first, how did you get on this journey of colliding art, technology, cultural traditions, and fashion? And the second, which a lot of people ask me, is where are you from? So just to clear the air, I was born in the US. I grew up across Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then I moved to a small town in Arizona. And to give you context on how small it was, my nickname was Asia, because I was the only kid from the continent. And behind me, that's my grandma. If you recognize it, it's the Grand Canyon. And my grandma, she helped me grow up both in Hong Kong and also in Arizona. And on Sundays, we would drive an hour out to Chinese school, where I would learn Chinese. And on the way there, we would go to one of the only restaurants in the town. It was called Taco Bell. And she would go to the condiments section, get all the napkins, get all of the hot sauce, the mild, the fiery, the Diablo, and then she would stuff it into the cubbies of the Toyota minivan on our way to Chinese school. And I was really embarrassed by it. I didn't want any of the other kids to be in the car. And as I grew up, though, she started to lose her memory. She started to develop dementia. And when I went back to Hong Kong to see her 10 years later, she didn't even know who I was. So there was a chest that was in this apartment in Hong Kong, and there were a lot of old photos. I started to ask her and get a sense of who she was. And I learned a few things that really shocked me. One, she left China, her village, when she was 10, and she was in Hong Kong alone. She tried to make ends meet, so she started with selling salted eggs. And every time the police came, she would hide her salted eggs and run away. The rest of her family was still back in China, but as the Cultural Revolution intensified, because they were part of the creative and intellectual class, they were put into prison. But she worked really hard. She learned how to befriend an abacus, and she started a real estate business. And by the time the Cultural Revolution intensified so deeply, most of her family members had actually, who were remaining, migrated to Hong Kong, and a lot of people were being housed in Hong Kong through her entrepreneurship. So through her creativity, her resilience, and entrepreneurship, she had 4 sons, including my dad right there. He ended up scoring #1 in math in Hong Kong and got his undergrad, master's, and PhD at MIT in 6 years. He ended up, his PhD thesis became one of the fundamental elements of wireless telephone communication. Unfortunately, I do not fulfill the stereotypes of being a math savant. I like art and music. I'm a cellist, and that comes from my mom over here. She comes from a family of creative people, and she was in Chiang Kai-shek's children's choir. So I think growing up, this is sort of maybe the origins of why I like to combine both art and technology, and also whether it's cultural or whether it's by art or how to fit in all these genres, I was always feeling kind of idiosyncratic, and I was very observant of misfits. How do I not stand out, or what are these systems in every society I was in? And so I studied architecture, and I ended up in India. And I'm really glad here we had so many cows when we landed. And in India, if you've ever been there, this is a whole different world where there's these cows that just float around everywhere. They're sort of a misfit as well, kind of awkward in this in-between. And these cows, they were very different from the cows I knew back at home. Their destiny was not going to be like, I'm an Angus beef that's going to end up at Tyson Foods. They had personalities. They were sassy because they're considered pretty holy. So I decided, what is it going to be like to be a cow living in a human city? So I picked the first cow that I saw and decided I was going to take my sketchbook and follow it wherever it went.
We're in the old city, and we are right now stalking this cow. And this is going to go on for 3 hours. Basically, the idea is that we're going to follow every single thing it does, report down what it eats, when it stalls.
After getting bullied the whole day.
Yeah, it gets bullied. There was a very large respect. So I ended up following these cows around and making very diligent notes in my sketchbook. And then I started to use Bushnell trackers and GPS, along with other forms of technologies to track these cows, to understand how they interact in these environments, how she moves. And then eventually, I was somehow able to convince US taxpayer dollars to give me a Fulbright and a Nat Geo grant to study and map more animals around the world and their interactions with different cities. This ended up into a larger cartographic project that I ended up doing with the Indian government, really looking at this relationship between urbanization, the rural and the urban, and how do we map the future of where a lot of these dynamics are going. But one of the things that I noticed when I was following so many cows around was, how did they awkwardly end up in the city? They had owners. There were migrants that brought them into the cities. And these migrants were indigenous people who actually had a home, and these cows had roots. So I followed a lot of these migrants back to their homes and where these cows were originally from. And this is a place that actually really, really grounded me. It was a place where people were rooted to the land. They were connected to the food that they'd grown. The idea of materiality has a very different definition out here. Clothes that you're wearing is handmade. It's passed down from generation to generation. This idea of provenance is so different. It's not just, a Cartier ring. It's something that has a lot of meaning and rootedness in who they were as people, in their culture, their expressions, and their art. And even though these formats were evolving, there was still something that was so beautiful that reflected this lifestyle. Yet, one of the things I noticed was that there was also this insecurity of being awkward. The narrative that was given to so many different communities is that you're backwards and the future looks very different, and you're awkward. And so a lot of them would leave, and they would end up in these cities trying to and bring their cows along in search for a better future. So in some ways, following cows would become the beginning of following my own roots. And I started to really think through, there were 3 things that we really needed to think about in terms of how do we reverse authorship of what is actually should be celebrated. So the 3 things I thought through was, 1, how do we take the idea of the struggling artist struggling out of artist? 2, in order to do that, you had to figure out how to make money. So I had to figure out the markets that would pay for it. Fashion is a $32 billion market annually, and it has this cultural appropriation issue. But instead of it being accusatory, it comes from the fact that people want to share ideas. And the power of exploration, especially when we are interacting with different communities, should be this idea of sharing. But how do we create the structures to do that equitably? And 3, how do we create this idea of provenance, right? The thing that is like, nothing is like actually original, but is there a way that we can bring technology alongside that? So this became my journey from explorer to entrepreneurship. I took Getty Images model, which was, they created a giant archive, and I said, let's do the same thing for the creative unseen. And let's create the largest cultural art exchange using blockchain technology, IP licensing and royalty systems, but then do this for the millions of creative unseen.
So there are millions of indigenous artists around the world. Together, they would form the fourth largest economy. Cultural appropriation creates a big loss of opportunity for a lot of these artists. My name is Rebecca Hui. I'm the founder and CEO of Root Studio. Root Studio is a collective of indigenous artists and creators, and we digitize and license artwork to the fashion and retail industry. So there are millions of indigenous artists around the world, but a lot of these artists are receiving less than 2% of the profit. At the same time, you have a $2.4 trillion fashion industry that is constantly looking for inspiration from ethnic designs. We train the artists to digitize the designs. It then gets coded and uploaded into our online library that then allows brands from around the world to be able to pay a fee to browse and then select designs.
And so from there, what happens to these designs? I will walk you through from what happens in the village all the way to the end consumer. So this is in the Sundarbans region. It's between India, Bangladesh. It's this amazing, super biodiverse region that has a lot of elephants. We work for the last 7 years with a group that's near the delta over there. And they have these amazing scroll painting traditions where people would sing alongside as a form of traditional storytelling. Unfortunately, it's a rapidly disappearing art form, but the roots of it is extremely sustainable, right? When the artist told me that the scroll painting, I was like, is that orange? They're like, no, it's actually marigold, and it's not called yellow, it's turmeric. So here is one of the scroll paintings from that village. Tagore Chichakar is one of our portfolio artists, and she's going to tell you what the meaning of it in Bengali, and I'm going to translate it. She's saying all the animals are having a meeting in the Sundarbans. Everyone's been getting along except the lions and the tigers have been eating everyone else. The lions and tigers come by and say, if we don't eat you, then we're going to starve. What should we do? The elephant, the blue one over here, chimes in and says, we have to eat alternatives. In order for us to coexist, we have to eat alternatives instead of eat each other. So this was licensed as Patagonia's first external design partnership in their 50 years history. And they did it for their 50th year collection called Together across over 100,000 units. Unfortunately, you can't go on their site because it's sold out. But I do have one men's and one women's shorts. If you want to jump into the ocean tomorrow with these baggies. And we started to replicate the same process, training community organizers to digitize their artwork, creating systems for them to take a lot of their cultural heritage and relics, creating the same IP systems that artists have in the West, but doing this for all of these different artists. Now working with over 42 communities globally, over 4,800 artists. And we have now basically shown all of this artwork, thousands of artwork, to almost every single fashion brand that you can think of. Probably what you're wearing is a fashion brand that has either license or is someone that has seen this artwork. And what this means is that we have 5 million products in distribution, and this has tripled the annual household income of the artists and the communities that we have worked with, creating consistent revenue for them for 7 years without having to leave the village. And the reason why we look at the fashion industry is because this is, in some ways, the arbitrage of the value of art and culture. I'm like a hedge fund manager, but for cultural value. And so we really look at also tracking the systems for impact. I know you see 67%, that was 3 years ago. Actually, now we're up to 91, so. But we really look at building these systems so there's tangible metrics around how we can effectively bridge cultures. But we don't really want to just stop at fashion. As one of my teammates, Kirat, from the Bodo indigenous tribe says, the formats in which our stories and our art will always change. But the stories will always stay with us, and so will our identities. So in a world, as artists are very concerned about artificial intelligence, one thing that we've seen and have been approached by big tech and recently is that there's actually a lot of beauty in the human provenance story of what was actually created, right? And we know that things evolve over time, but can you actually continue to build respect, reciprocity, and remuneration into how we exchange and interact with all of this culture and beauty around the world? And another thing I'm really excited about is the power of art to bridge cultures in a time of so much polarity and divisions. Sometimes we have to think beyond our rational mind and actually go back to the things that make us human, the music that makes us dance, the fashion that inspires us. And so we're now working with a number of communities around the world who have amazing art forms, but is largely isolated. And we're creating ways not just for their work to get out, but for them to collaborate with one another, to go back to the roots of what it's like to open up your home, the hospitality culture, in a time where we need to emphasize more, it's people, not monoliths. So I'll just end with this. So much more powerful to remind ourselves that we all share the same human experience, that we share the same earth, the air, the land, the oceans. That's what we're hoping to do with Bourbon by Root Studios, to bridge cultures, to transcend something that's beyond us representing one country or another. It's really about representing humans and individuals with different cultural ways of being and thinking and identities. On the other side of the planet, if I can learn and expand my curiosity, like this is just gonna be better, and all for a planet in balance, for diplomacy and for how we understand each other, more so than what our politicians or news can do right now. Thank you.